According to Luke, the 16th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. And so he summoned him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Give me an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. And then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? And he answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. And he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. And then he asked another, how much do you owe? And he replied, 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill, and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager, because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into their eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
A long time ago, I'm going back a long time ago often, it seems to me. Must be a thing of age. But anyway, when I first went on pastoral internship, I'd moved Virginia to Iowa. And at the time I thought, man, this is quite the thing here. There was two large churches in a town of about 4,000 people. Two Lutheran churches, one of a German background, one of a Norwegian background. One of about 1,000 members, another of about 750 members at the time. And I was going to be the intern at both of those churches, and my primary responsibility was the youth. However, the other part is that I was supposed to preach once in one church a month and once in the other church another time. And at that time, preaching was not my thing. And so I wondered about that. But the one congregation that was the larger had one pastor that was, well, getting close to retirement. And what he really wanted he wanted some cheap help is what he needed, because he had way too much to do. He did the Sunday bulletin, he did all kinds of things, and him and his wife pretty much ran the church and did everything. But there was, and often he was kind of criticized. And one of the things he was criticized was he talked about money a lot, about giving and stewardship and so forth, and that was his real forte. And people didn't like hearing about that. And as I thought about that at the time and have reflected upon that later, two things come to mind. One is that brings up people's guilt. You know, they're really not as generous as they claim to be, or they think they are. And the other thing is, Jesus talks about money a lot. A lot. But the amazing thing about that was that congregation, and because of him, was a 50-50 congregation. I had never heard of that before. What was a 50-50 congregation? A 50-50 congregation was you gave 50% of what you received away, and you kept 50% for your own expenses and needs in the congregation. That was almost unfathomable to me. And I remember some years later that the ELCA, when it first started out, wanted to get 2% on an average across the board. And that they would have outlined all these things that would be possible if all the people who were members and all the congregation just gave 2%. 50%. 50-50. One of the things they did for 30 years was support a missionary in Japan. For 30 years. Anna Marie Mitchell. I traveled to Japan and I met her and where she had served for all those years. 50-50. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that in this congregation? Can you imagine that in the church? I don't know what's happened since. But that's something for us to think about. And it came to me as I was working on this text about this dishonest manager. We don't really have any real idea about his dishonesty or lying or cheating or anything of that sort. He's actually commended for being rather shrewd, rather smart, rather forward-thinking. It's been a difficult text for people down through the ages because it sort of seems to be gratifying things that we don't often think are the good things of Christianity. Well, this man is speaking about stewardship. The manager is a shrewd guy. But the rich man is really talking about stewardship. He doesn't seem to be letting him go because of dishonest behavior, particularly, although that word is used. But he actually commends him. He commends him. But he doesn't like what he does. He wants to let him go because he's a poor steward. He's squandering. Now, if you think back, and it's skipped over in this year's lectionary, but it's the parable of the lost son. That was his problem, was he was squandering the wealth that he'd received from his father. If you're not familiar with that word, it simply means being wasteful. And I think that's the word for us. The word for us is waste. Wasteful. And I think this text opens up a whole new era about our being wasteful, about squandering. Because that's why the rich man was letting him go. It's not that he wasn't a good manager. It wasn't that he didn't do a lot of the right things. But he was wasteful. Maybe we should say careless in some ways. Well, what about us? What about wasteful? What about going back to that 50-50 congregation? Because it really opens up the whole thing about how do we spend, particularly the money, but mostly all the resources that God has given to us. What kind of stewards are we? Are we being wasteful? So when you go out and you buy that new house, or you buy that new car, or you get that new ATV, or you buy that little trinket in the store, are you willing to give 50-50 to the work of the kingdom? To charity, to church, to wherever it is? Because I think Jesus is saying and using this parable to indicate us that so much of what we do is wasteful. We are not being good stewards. It is calling us on the carpet for being poor stewards of God's creation, of God's world, of the resources that He's given to us. That we are being wasteful. And I don't think we have to go very far to say that we have a lot of waste. We claim that for government. We claim that when we go to the restaurant and we put all this stuff in the trash. All the stuff that is waste. Jesus is telling us we're squandering the resources that He gave us and gave to us. One of the things that we do when we travel, and it's kind of a crazy thing when you think about it, but we make every effort to recycle everything. We even take stuff home thousands of miles because I don't want to put that plastic into that container. To be wasteful, to be squandering. You see, it asks us to be the good stewards of what God has given us. And maybe if we go to 50-50, it's the only way we can really be good stewards. Because then we find that we have to live with a lot less. That we waste a lot less. That we give a lot less, or we give a lot more to things that are more important than just our own gratification. You see, it is something that really smacks in the very face of the consumerism in which our world, and particularly our country, is based upon. When we say that 70% of our economy depends upon consumerism. Going out and buying all that stuff that's made in Vietnam and China and Mexico and even here in the United States. How wasteful we are. So it really calls us into question about the stewardship in which we act and what we do. This man is, according to the rich man, is a smart guy. And we have no hint of it in this story on whether it is a sense of, is this rich man really aware, or how aware is he of marking these down? Or the olive oil and the grain? Is he really aware of that? Or another way to say that, are those people who have those bills, are they aware of that he hasn't gotten permission from the rich man to do that? That sort of there's a little fire sale here, or a little discount that he's handing out just to be generous. We don't really know that. We don't know what really the rich man is really doing here. What is really happening. And we might think about God as being the rich man. And what if He is? And He acknowledges that the ways of the world are often clever and shrewd. And we have a way to figure this out. But I think the real important thing about this is, when we look back into the Old Testament, if you think about that story about Israel wandering in the wilderness, you see, we get a very keen idea here about the wastefulness. And God sort of sets out the parameters, and I haven't really ever seen this anywhere, but in a sense, it is one of the first things of conservation and stewardship of God's gifts. Because the Israelites are grumbling in the wilderness because, well, we could just well died back in Egypt rather than starving out here in the desert. And so God hears their cries and brings them what? Manna and quails. But what's the catch? The catch is when you go out in the morning and you collect all the manna to have enough to survive the day, you don't collect more. Because what happens? The maggots come and it is all destroyed if you get extra. And that's what happens. And then God is in control because He says, well, now on the sixth day, you collect twice as much because you want some for the next day. Well, if you think about it, well, the next day it's all rotting and the maggots have moved in. Oh no. God says, no, if you do it in the right way, on the Sabbath, you've got enough for the next day. But if you collect too much in the wrong way, it's bad news. It's going to be rotten. It's going to be maggot-filled. And the Israelites lived that way for 40 years, according to the Old Testament, according to Exodus, because they were good stewards. They recognized what they needed and not anything more. They recognized what they had and nothing more. You see, that's the way it is in this parable. You start getting greedy, you start collecting more, and all humankind begins to collapse. And so we have the very rich and the very poor and a few people in between. People who have a lot, people who don't have very much. People who've abused God's resources, and people who are starving and trying to get those resources. You see, this parable speaks to us about the stewardship that needs to be a part of our life. And it really is something that we really need to think seriously about. The other thing about this parable is that this man is thinking ahead. But the problem is what is he thinking ahead about? The problem is that he's thinking about his own skin, about his own self, about the shame of having to beg or of not being strong enough to dig, to be a trench digger, manual laborer, but he needs to survive. So it calls into his question his own abilities to survive without this position as manager. And I think that's why the rich man commends him. Because he's thinking ahead. He's planning ahead. But that's only a part of the truth. The part of the truth that really is significant is what is he planning ahead for? You see, that's also the word, I think, for us. Financial advisors are a big thing these days. You see it advertised all over in the shoppers and newspapers and the radio, online, TV. Planning ahead for your future retirement, even if you're retired and have been that way for years. How can you maximize? How can you have more? How can you get more? But you see, the fallback in the story is that it's just about himself. It's not about others. It's not about God's kingdom. It's not about the things that God really cares about. So planning ahead is something that's important. But what are you planning ahead for? Over the last, I suppose, at least a decade or two, there's a movement within society, and mostly a young among, man, why can't I talk this morning? Mostly among young people. Minimalism. Having just what you need. And I think part of that is because they don't have the resources to have all the stuff. Or they don't want to put in the effort. Or they think it's more important to walk through the park than to work overtime. Or it's more important to do certain things to enjoy life, to experience life, to have a better life, more fulfilling and satisfying life, rather than just accumulating wealth. The problem with that is what are you planning for? It still becomes back to oneself. of how they get by, what they do, what their goals and aspirations are, what they don't do and don't do, what they want and don't want. And so it's planning ahead. But what are you planning for? You see, it all boils down to is, what has God entrusted us with? As a congregation, as individuals, as a community, as a whole Christian church. You see, can we be entrusted with these? And we can say that, well, thank goodness God is very forgiving, because we are not very trustworthy when it comes down to the resources that He's given to us. And it doesn't take us very far and very long to figure that out. But in a sense, that's not good enough. Because if we are to move and to grow as Christians, we need to realize that our stewardship needs to be better. We need to know that our planning ahead needs to be better. I remember one of the things my dad, I guess I'm on my dad this morning. My dad said, and I remember exactly what we were talking about, but I remember his line. But it was something like, not planting an oak tree or something of that sort. But he was saying, well, that's not of real interest to me because I won't be around to see it. Well, unfortunately, that's a little short-sighted, because what are we planning for? What are we planning for ourselves, or for future generations, or for other people? Because that, I think, is what this manager, this rich man, and the manager are talking about. Is that when we're planning ahead, are we just planning for ourselves? Are we just thinking what we'll experience, what we'll be able to accomplish, what we'll reap the benefits from? And Jesus is telling us, you need to plan ahead. But planning ahead just for your own self is not the thing. To be a good steward and to plan ahead is to take into consideration others, not oneself. It's to take into consideration the kingdom of God and what God is interested in. Because we are experiencing that division about wealth and the kingdom. About you can't serve God and mammon, money, wealth. And that becomes a very difficult thing. Because we all, or most of us anyway, all of them that I know of you, we have lots. And we should probably be ashamed about when we look at the rest of the world, because the rest of the world doesn't have much. And that's what God, I think, is calling us into question here. Are we taking the stewardship, the leadership of stewardship as Christian people? Are we contributing to the goodness and the wholesomeness of God and His kingdom? Or are we simply bathing ourselves in the wealth and accomplishment that we have made? You see, the question that raises us is, can God entrust us with this? And we shouldn't take that as something that's bad. It should spur us. It should spur us on to be more generous, to be more kind, to be more accepting, to be more forgiving, to be more gracious, to be more merciful. It's like disciplining a child. It's not that we want them to turn out bad. We discipline them because we want them to turn out good. And I think that's what God is telling us in this particular parable, and in other places as well. So when we go back to the church that had 50-50 giving, and on the envelope it said that, benevolence, or I'm not sure what the other line was, hometown church or whatever. When we think about all that, you see, that raises the question about our entrusting and about how we can be honest or dishonest in little or much. God is one who asks us to be faithful in both little things and much. When we sing this hymn at the end of the service today, "Take my life and let it be," can we say that about our resources, about our life? Are we giving that most of what we need to be giving? Or are we just giving sort of what's, acceptable? Because 50-50 giving's a long way from 2%, and it's just about as long away from tithing at 10%. And so it really calls us into question about what God has entrusted with us and asks us to take on as our own responsibility. Because you could think about what this congregation could be if we were doing 50-50 and you were doing 50-50 at your house. It's amazing. And that's the way God is. God expects a lot and can do amazing things. And so may the peace of God that surpasses all understanding keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.